Sarah Chen never imagined this Monday would be different from any other. The autumn breeze rustled through her carefully prepared case files as she walked up the marble steps of the downtown courthouse. The building's shadows stretched across the plaza, where news vans had already gathered like vultures awaiting their next story. Inside her briefcase, a worn manila folder contained the details of her latest case, defending Marcus Thompson, a respected art restoration expert with 20 years of experience at the city's most prestigious museums. The morning edition of the Daily Chronicle lay folded on top, its headline screaming accusations. Museum's priceless Renaissance painting vanishes. Restoration expert prime suspect. Sarah paused at the courthouse entrance, taking a moment to observe her client sitting alone on a wooden bench near the security checkpoint. Marcus Thompson didn't fit the profile of the criminals she usually defended. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the morning light as he anxiously flipped through a small notebook filled with technical drawings. His fingers, stained with years of careful work on priceless artworks, trembled slightly as he turned each page. During their previous meetings, something about Marcus's demeanor had caught Sarah's attention. While most clients focused on proclaiming their innocence or expressing fear about potential sentences, Marcus kept returning to one peculiar detail: the antique frame that had housed the missing Botticelli. He would describe its intricate golden scrollwork, the specific angle of the corner joints, and the unique restoration techniques required for such delicate woodwork. At first, Sarah had dismissed these ramblings as the nervous chatter of a worried man, but now she wondered if there was something more to his obsession with these details. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity as Sarah approached Marcus. Junior attorneys rushed past, with stacks of documents, while court officers directed confused citizens to their designated courtrooms. A group of art history professors from the local university huddled nearby, presumably waiting to serve as expert witnesses for the prosecution. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional despite the growing media circus around them. "Are you ready?" Marcus looked up, his eyes reflecting both fear and a hint of determination. "Ms. Chen, I've been thinking about the frame again. The replacement they installed last month, it wasn't sealed properly. The humidity controls would have been compromised. No experienced restorer would have." Sarah gently interrupted him, something she rarely did with clients. "Mr. Thompson, I understand the technical details are important to you, but today we need to focus on the prosecution's evidence. They're claiming they have security footage of you accessing the gallery after hours." Marcus's face paled. "That's impossible. I haven't worked late since the new security system was installed. The old cameras used to have blind spots near the Renaissance wing, which is why we always had 2 people present during evening restoration work. But the new system..." Sarah's instincts flickered to life. After 15 years of defending cases, she learned to trust these moments when clients revealed seemingly insignificant details. She pulled out her notebook, her pen hovering over the blank page. "Tell me more about this new security system. When exactly was it installed?" The courthouse bells chimed 9 times, signaling the start of the day's proceedings. As Sarah listened to Marcus explain the technical changes in the museum's security protocols, she had no way of knowing that this simple detail about system upgrades would soon turn the entire case upside down. Courtroom 302 fell silent as Prosecutor James Barrett rose from his chair, his Italian leather shoes clicking confidently against the polished floor. The large display screen positioned beside the witness stand flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the tense faces of the jury members. "Your Honor," Barrett announced, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone who had won countless cases, "the prosecution would like to present Exhibit A, security footage from the museum's Renaissance wing on the night in question." Sarah Chen watched Barrett carefully, noting how he had positioned himself perfectly between the judge's bench and the jury box. His reputation preceded him. In 10 years as a prosecutor, he had never lost an art theft case. His dark suit and red tie projected an image of authority, and his silver hair added an air of distinguished experience that juries tended to trust. The footage began to play, showing the museum's dimly lit corridors. Barrett gestured dramatically toward the screen. "Ladies and gentlemen, please pay close attention to the timestamp. 9:47 p.m., well after closing hours." The camera angle provided a clear view of the Botticelli Gallery, where a figure in a blue jacket moved with deliberate steps toward the painting. "Note the familiarity with which this person navigates the space," Barrett continued, asking the technician to replay the sequence. "This is someone who knows the layout intimately, someone with authorized access." His eyes flickered meaningfully toward Marcus Thompson, who sat rigid beside Sarah. On the third replay, Barrett approached the screen, using a laser pointer to trace the figure's path. Observe the distinctive gait, the slight favoring of the right leg. Mr. Thompson suffered a minor knee injury last year, documented in the museum's employee records. The jurors leaned forward, several nodding as Barrett built his narrative. Sarah, however, found her attention drawn to something else entirely. In the background of the footage, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, stood the museum's pride and joy. An antique grandfather clock, its brass pendulum gleaming in the security lights. Marcus must have noticed it too. He slid a small note across the defense table. "That clock shows Monday, but the weight chains are wrong for a Monday." Sarah glanced at him questioningly, and he added in hurried whispers, "The weights lower each day. By Thursday night, they're always at the bottom. Someone winds them Friday morning." Sarah's mind raced as Barrett continued his presentation, now showing enhanced stills of the figure's face. The images were grainy, the kind of security footage that could convince a jury through suggestion rather than clarity. Barrett had built his case masterfully. The blue jacket matching museum staff uniforms, the timing suggesting inside knowledge, even the walking pattern pointing to her client. But that clock in the background nagged at her thoughts. If Marcus was right about the weights, something wasn't adding up. She began making careful notes, marking timestamps and camera angles, while Barrett confidently declared to the jury, "The evidence, ladies and gentlemen, speaks for itself." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. In her experience, evidence rarely spoke for itself. It needed context, verification, and most importantly, the right questions. As Barrett wrapped up his presentation to appreciative murmurs from the gallery, she was already formulating her strategy for cross-examination. Sometimes the most damning evidence contained the seeds of its own undoing. The fluorescent lights of Sarah's downtown office hummed steadily as the city outside descended into darkness. Digital numbers on her desk clock blinked relentlessly. 11:42 p.m., 1:15 a.m., 2:53 a.m. Empty coffee cups created a small cityscape on her desk, testament to hours of scrutiny over the museum's security footage. Her colleagues had long since departed, leaving the office floor eerily quiet except for the soft whir of her laptop and the occasional distant siren. The security footage played on an endless loop on her screen, each viewing making her more certain she was missing something crucial. Frame by frame, she muttered, clicking through the sequence for what felt like the 1,000th time. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but Marcus's words about the clock weights kept echoing in her mind. The grandfather clock stood like a sentinel in the background of every frame, its brass pendulum catching the security lights. Sarah pulled up the museum's maintenance records on her second screen. Her client's obsession with details had sparked something. There had to be a connection between the clock's maintenance schedule and what she was seeing in the footage. She began creating a timeline, meticulously noting the position of the clock weights in the video against the documented winding schedule. At 3:27 a.m., she froze the video mid-frame, her coffee cup halting halfway to her lips. The weight chains were clearly visible in this angle, hanging almost to the bottom of the clock case. According to the maintenance logs, the weights should have been near the top on a Thursday evening. They were wound every Friday morning without fail. "Got you," she whispered, suddenly fully awake. She quickly cross-referenced the museum's security upgrade records. The new system had been installed just weeks before the alleged theft, with a completely different camera configuration. The old system's footage shouldn't even be compatible with the new interface. Sarah began pulling up archived photos from the museum's social media accounts, confirming the clock's weight positions on different days of the week. Her hands shook slightly as she assembled the evidence, not from caffeine, but from the realization that Barrett's supposedly airtight case had a fatal flaw. She reached for her phone, checking the time. 3:45 a.m. Too early to call Marcus, but she needed to verify one final detail. She drafted a quick email to the museum's head of maintenance, requesting urgent confirmation of the clock winding schedule for the past 3 months. The reply came surprisingly quickly, just minutes later. The maintenance head was apparently as much of a night owl as she was. His response confirmed everything. The clock winding schedule hadn't changed in 15 years. Every Friday morning, like clockwork. Sarah leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a small smile. Barrett had built his entire case on footage that couldn't possibly be from the night of the theft. The person in the blue jacket, the distinctive walk, all of it was from a different day entirely. Dawn was breaking as she began preparing her notes for cross-examination. She would need to present this discovery carefully. Timing was everything, both in grandfather clocks and in courtroom revelations. As she gathered her materials, she noticed her hands were steady despite the excess of coffee. The certainty of having uncovered the truth had a way of calming even the most caffeine-riddled nerves. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, creating dramatic shadows across the polished floor of courtroom 302. Sarah Chen entered deliberately, carrying only a slim leather portfolio containing a single printed email and her handwritten notes. The usual tower of legal documents and case files was notably absent from her arsenal today. Judge Martinez noticed the change immediately. Her eyebrows rose slightly above her reading glasses as Sarah took her place at the defense table. In 15 years of appearances before her, Sarah had never arrived without at least 3 reference books and a stack of exhibits. The judge's eyes followed the lone portfolio with careful interest. Marcus Thompson sat tensely beside Sarah, his fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on the wooden table, the same delicate movements he used when restoring ancient artwork. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm and whispered, "Trust me." He nodded, though the worry lines around his eyes remained deeply etched. Across the aisle, James Barrett was finishing his methodical presentation of evidence. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who believed victory was merely a formality. "And so, Your Honor, the prosecution has clearly established not only means and opportunity, but also the unique physical identification of the defendant through his distinctive gait pattern." The jury members nodded along with Barrett's words. Sarah studied their faces. 3 were taking detailed notes, 2 were leaning forward with intense focus, and 1 elderly gentleman in the back row appeared to be fighting sleep. But it was the expression of juror number 4, a retired physics teacher, that caught her attention. He had been watching the clock and the security footage with particular interest. Barrett continued his performance, using phrases like "beyond any reasonable doubt" and "incontrovertible evidence" with the timing of a practiced conductor. His visual aids were impeccable, enlarged still frames from the security footage, time-stamped and annotated with professional precision. Sarah allowed him his moment of triumph. Experience had taught her that overconfidence often preceded the greatest falls. She withdrew the email from her portfolio and placed it carefully on the table, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle from the paper. "And finally," Barrett announced, gathering his materials with a flourish, "the prosecution rests, confident that the evidence speaks unequivocally to the defendant's guilt." He sat down, adjusting his red tie with satisfaction. The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to Sarah. Judge Martinez leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Chen, you may proceed with your cross-examination." Sarah rose slowly, leaving her portfolio on the table. She approached the podium with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The gallery held its breath, expecting her typical thorough dissection of evidence. Instead, she smiled slightly. "Your Honor, I have only one question for the prosecution's security expert." She paused, meeting Barrett's confident gaze. "But before I ask it, I would request that the security footage be displayed once more, focusing on the background of frame 147. Barrett's smile remained fixed, but Sarah noticed his left hand move slightly toward his water glass. After 15 years of courtroom battles, she had learned to read these small tells. He was about to discover that his slam-dunk case was built on a foundation as delicate as the ancient artworks his security footage had failed to protect. The security footage flickered to life on the courtroom's display screen, casting a bluish glow across the expectant faces of the gallery. Sarah Chen stood perfectly still as the technician navigated to frame 147. The antique grandfather clock stood prominently in the background, its brass pendulum frozen in mid-swing. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice calm and clear, "I would like to call Mr. Edward Morton to the stand." The museum's head curator walked forward, his bow tie slightly askew, betraying his nervousness. After the usual swearing-in, Sarah approached the witness box with unhurried steps. "Mr. Morton, you've been the head curator at the City Museum for how long?" 27 years next month, he replied, straightening his glasses with pride. Sarah nodded appreciatively. "And during your tenure, you've overseen many priceless artifacts, including the museum's antique grandfather clock visible in this security footage, correct?" Morton's face lit up. The clock was clearly a favorite topic. "Yes, indeed. That's our pride and joy. A 1788 Thomas Tompion. Been with the museum since 1925. "Fascinating," Sarah replied, allowing genuine interest to color her voice. "And this clock requires regular maintenance, doesn't it?" "Oh, absolutely. These mechanical masterpieces need consistent care. That's why we have such a strict winding schedule." Barrett shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming silently on the table. Sarah caught the motion in her peripheral vision, but kept her focus on the curator. "Could you tell us about this winding schedule, Mr. Morton?" "Of course. Every Friday at precisely 9 a.m., our maintenance team winds the clock. It's been the same schedule for decades. We never deviate. These antique mechanisms thrive on consistency." Sarah walked to her table and picked up the single sheet of paper. "And this schedule is documented in the museum's maintenance logs, correct?" "Yes, meticulously. I sign off on it personally each week." Sarah turned to the display screen. "Mr. Morton, looking at frame 147, what day does the timestamp show?" "Thursday, 9:47 p.m., he replied confidently. "And could you describe the position of the clock weights in this image?" Morton leaned forward, squinting slightly at the screen. His expression suddenly changed, professional pride giving way to confusion. That's not right. The weights are near the top position. On a Thursday night, they should be almost at the bottom of their tracks. They wouldn't be rewound until Friday morning." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Barrett's drumming fingers went still. "Mr. Morton, in your expert opinion, could this footage possibly be from a Thursday night?" The curator's face had gone pale. "No, absolutely not. Those weight positions are only seen on Friday afternoons or over the weekend. This must be from a different day entirely." Sarah turned to face the jury. "And when was the museum's new security system installed?" 3 weeks before the alleged theft. We completely replaced the old system. New cameras, new software, everything. One final question, Mr. Morton. Would footage from the old security system be compatible with the new one? The curator shook his head emphatically. Impossible. Different formats entirely. You couldn't even open old system files on the new equipment. Sarah met Barrett's gaze across the courtroom. His face had lost its confident glow as the implications became clear. The evidence he built his entire case around, the footage he played repeatedly for the jury, couldn't possibly be from the night of the theft. It wasn't even from the same security system. The silence in courtroom 302 lasted precisely 3 seconds before chaos erupted. Judge Martinez's reading glasses slipped down her nose as she leaned forward, her usual stern expression giving way to astonishment. Barrett shot up from his chair so quickly that his leather portfolio tumbled to the floor, scattering papers across the polished wood. "Your Honor, if I may," Barrett started, his voice having lost its previous smoothness. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to gather the fallen documents. "You may not," Judge Martinez interrupted, her tone carrying a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Mr. Morton, please continue explaining the implications of what you've just told us about the security systems." The curator straightened his bow tie nervously. "Well, Your Honor, it's quite simple, really. When we upgraded the security system, we completely replaced everything. Cameras, software, storage systems. The old system used in proprietary format that the new system can't even read. It would be like trying to play a vinyl record on a DVD player." Sarah Chen remained standing, perfectly still, watching the jury's reactions. The retired physics teacher in the fourth seat was nodding vigorously, while several others were whispering behind raised hands. She had learned long ago that these moments of realization were best served with silence. Furthermore, Morton continued, warming to his subject, "The person in the blue jacket, that's standard uniform for our Friday restoration team. They always work late on Fridays, documenting and photographing ongoing projects. That's why we schedule the clock winding for Friday mornings, to avoid disrupting their work." Barrett finally managed to collect his scattered papers. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief recess to examine this new information." Judge Martinez's laugh, when it came, was both surprising and genuine. "Mr. Barrett, what you're actually requesting is time to explain to your superiors how you built an entire case on evidence that predates not only the alleged crime, but the entire security system itself." In the gallery, journalists were already slipping out their phones, fingers flying across screens. Sarah could practically see tomorrow's headlines writing themselves. At the defense table, Marcus Thompson sat perfectly still, his restorer's hands folded carefully in his lap, his expression a mix of relief and lingering disbelief. "Ms. Chen," Judge Martinez continued, "I assume you have documentation to support this timeline of security system upgrades." Sarah lifted her single sheet of paper. "Yes, Your Honor. I have the official maintenance logs, signed by Mr. Morton, showing both the clock winding schedule and the security system replacement dates. I've also taken the liberty of requesting the original installation company's records, which should be arriving by courier within the hour." Barrett sank slowly back into his chair. His red tie, previously worn with such confidence, now seemed to hang like a noose around his neck. "Your Honor, in light of this development, the prosecution requests time to review the validity of our evidence." Judge Martinez nodded, but her eyes held a spark of amusement. "Motion granted. We'll recess for 1 hour. Mr. Barrett, I suggest you use this time wisely." She turned to Sarah. "Ms. Chen, excellent attention to detail. Sometimes the simplest questions reveal the largest truths." As the judge's gavel fell, the courtroom burst into animated discussion. Sarah gathered her single sheet of paper, tucking it carefully back into her portfolio. In the gallery, she could see the museum's board members huddled together, their faces a mix of embarrassment and concern. Sometimes, she reflected, the most devastating evidence wasn't what was present in a case, but what was impossible to have been there at all. The hour-long recess stretched into 2 as Barrett huddled with his team in a side conference room. Through the frosted glass, Sarah could see agitated shadows pacing back and forth. She remained in the courtroom, sharing a quiet lunch with Marcus while they waited. Her client had finally stopped fidgeting with his hands, the tension in his shoulders noticeably easing. "I still can't believe you noticed the clock waits," Marcus said, unwrapping his sandwich. Everyone else was so focused on the blue jacket, the walking pattern. Sarah smiled. "You're the one who mentioned it first. I just paid attention." She took a sip of her water, watching as more people filed back into the courtroom. Sometimes the most important evidence is in the background, not center stage. At precisely 2:15 p.m., Barrett re-entered the courtroom. His red tie was slightly loose, and his previously immaculate silver hair showed signs of nervous fingers running through it. Behind him, two junior prosecutors carried boxes of files, their faces grim. Judge Martinez returned to her bench, adjusting her robes with deliberate care. "Mr. Barrett, I trust you've had sufficient time to evaluate your position." Barrett stood, his usual commanding presence diminished. "Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution has conducted a thorough review of our evidence." He paused, swallowing hard. "Upon investigation, we've discovered that the security footage in question was indeed from the previous month's routine maintenance records. Furthermore," he glanced at his notes, "we've confirmed that Mr. Thompson was actually in a documented meeting with the museum's board of directors at the time the painting disappeared." A collective gasp rose from the gallery. Sarah noticed the museum's board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. That particular detail hadn't been in any of her notes. Additionally, Barrett continued, his voice growing quieter, "Our office has received new information regarding unusual access patterns to the museum's storage areas by a member of the visiting exhibition team from Europe. We are currently pursuing these leads." Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Am I to understand, Mr. Barrett, that you are withdrawing your case against Mr. Thompson?" "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecution moves to dismiss all charges. The judge's gavel cracked sharply against the sound block. "Motion granted. Mr. Thompson, you are free to go." Ms. Chen, exemplary work. She turned her attention to Barrett. "Mr. Barrett, I expect a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning, explaining how evidence this fundamentally flawed made it to my courtroom." As the gallery erupted in conversation, Sarah began packing her portfolio. Marcus sat stunned, tears forming in his eyes. "It's really over." "It's over," Sarah confirmed. "Though I suspect the museum will be offering you quite an attractive settlement to avoid any potential wrongful prosecution suits." From the corner of her eye, she caught Barrett making a hasty exit through the side door, followed by a pack of reporters. The museum's board members were already on their phones, likely calling emergency meetings to handle the public relations fallout. Marcus stood slowly, still processing his newfound freedom. "You know what the irony is," he said, straightening his jacket. "If they'd actually looked at the painting's frame like I kept trying to tell everyone, they would have noticed the restoration markings that proved it was moved on Friday, not Thursday." Sarah laughed softly. Sometimes the simplest details are the ones people overlook. She gathered her things, reflecting on how a single antique clock had unraveled what seemed to be an airtight case. In the end, time itself had proven to be the most reliable witness. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen stood in the museum's Renaissance wing, studying the recently recovered Botticelli painting in its ornate frame. The evening sun streamed through the skylight, casting a warm glow across the artwork. The antique grandfather clock chimed softly in the background, its weights now perfectly positioned for a Wednesday afternoon. "It looks even better than before," Marcus said, joining her at the display. As the museum's newly promoted head of conservation, he'd overseen the painting's careful restoration after its recovery from a storage facility in Geneva. The international art theft ring responsible had been apprehended, their scheme of replacing masterpieces with forgeries during traveling exhibitions finally exposed. "The frame looks different," Sarah observed, noticing the subtle changes in the golden scrollwork. Marcus smiled, his restorer's pride evident. "Those marks I kept trying to tell everyone about. They were actually proof that the original frame had been switched months before the painting disappeared. The forgers needed time to create an exact replica of the frame to hold their forgery." A group of law students toured nearby, their professor gesturing toward the clock. "And here's the famous tompion that cracked the case," the professor explained. "A perfect example of how the smallest detail can reveal the truth." Sarah and Marcus shared a knowing look. The case had become something of a legend in legal circles, featured in several law review articles about the importance of thorough evidence verification. Barrett had been reassigned to the tax division, his art crime conviction rate now a subject of internal review. The museum board approved my proposal, Marcus said, changing the subject. We're implementing new documentation procedures for all restoration work. Every piece will have a complete digital record, including daily photographs and environmental readings. Inspired by a certain clock's maintenance log? Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. Something like that, he chuckled. Sometimes the best systems are the simple ones that work consistently. They walked together toward the exit, passing the spot where the security camera had captured the infamous blue-jacketed figure. The new security systems cameras were now smaller, more discreet, but far more sophisticated. I got an interesting call yesterday, Sarah mentioned as they reached the lobby. The State Bar Association wants me to give a lecture series on attention to detail in criminal defense. Apparently, your case has become required reading for new attorneys. You should do it, Marcus replied. Though maybe don't tell them how you actually found the discrepancy. I noticed it because my client wouldn't stop talking about antique frames, might not make for the most dramatic lecture. Sarah laughed. Sometimes the best defense comes from listening to what seems irrelevant at first. Speaking of which, she pulled out her phone, showing him a news article. They found 3 more switched paintings in other museums. Same team, same method. They always did their switches on Fridays, right after the cleaning staff finished. Marcus shook his head in amazement. All that planning, and they got caught because of a clock's winding schedule. As they stepped out into the evening air, the museum's lights began to illuminate behind them. Sarah thought about the single sheet of paper that had turned the case, a simple maintenance log that proved more powerful than hours of expert testimony and technical evidence. You know what the DA's office started doing, she said, descending the steps. They now require all evidence timestamps to be cross-referenced with building maintenance schedules. They're calling it the Thompson Protocol. Marcus smiled. Time has a way of revealing the truth, doesn't it? Indeed it does, Sarah agreed, checking her watch. Indeed it does.